The purpose of our monthly meeting is to talk about innovation and frameworks and make sure that we are talking about what's going on around the world. We have an introductory video for the Global Council, and can we play that, please?
Hi, my name is Hitendra Patel. I represent the Global Innovation Management Institute. We are honored to be part of the Global Council for Innovation Organizations because we are very excited about the opportunity of spreading innovation globally through certifications and standards. This council that we have put together will allow us to share best practices, exchange ideas between universities, between governments, between companies, between different geographies. It is the exchange of these ideas and this ecosystem that we are building that will help us close the gap and democratize innovation everywhere, and improve the quality of life of every human on this planet.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Welcome everybody to the GCIO. Our speaker for this month is Steffen Gackstatter. Steffen's a good friend of mine. We have worked together in Arthur D. Little years ago. We wrote a book together at the Monitor Group on 101 innovation breakthroughs. And since then, he has worked across the globe, helping Fortune 500 companies with innovation management. And more recently, he is now a partner at Roland Berger in Germany and working globally in everywhere. Steffen, welcome to the GCIO.
Thank you very much, Hitendra. And thank you for having me in this council. I'm very proud to speak for you. So let me share my screen and I will directly start without further ado on my presentation. So please confirm if you can see my screen right now. Okay, thanks, Larissa. That's very helpful. So today, my speech is about how corporates work together with startups. So corporate startup engagement. And I assume most of the people on this call have either worked for corporates or for startups, but most likely also in this linkage between the two. And I would assume if your experience is only half the one that Hitendra and I have shared in the past, we have seen a lot of these examples be successful, but also a lot which have failed. And so I would like to share my experience on some of that and why I strongly believe this can be done right and can be done better and increase the likelihood of success. But as we have all talked in this area, maybe to make it a little bit more personal, let me also share some personal stories on that to start with. So my own daughter, she actually failed 2 years ago with her startup. And I mean, for most of you, you will probably say, especially from the Americas, you will say, well, that's great. That's a good first step to a successful entrepreneurship career. For people in other countries in the world, including Germany, this rather means you are banned from business for the next foreseeable future. So it's not really a pleasurable experience to have. If I look a little further in my family, I have very different experiences. I have 2 cousins which are in the startup world. One of the cousins is what you would call a serial entrepreneur with, I think he has founded now more than 20 startups. A lot of them successful, a lot of them non-successful, but he's constantly updating and building up on that with successes and failures, as I said. And then there's a second cousin who I have, and he has not done as many startups, but mainly 2 so far. I mean, he has 2 or 3 smaller ones, but the 2 ones, the first one he sold, I think about 5 years ago, very successfully to the German Postal Service. And the second one, he partners now with IBM as a senior partner of IBM, which is, I think, for a startup quite successful. So you see, even in my closest surrounding, I have some of these examples, but obviously also for myself in my career, as Hitendra said, having worked in the last 30 years both in consulting on the innovation side, as well as for some of the corporates, I've had many experiences which I'd like to share in the next 20 or so minutes with you. So let me go with you through that in some of the pages. First of all, maybe to say why thinking about startups, and why is it for corporates necessary, for us and for me as a strategy consultant being part of Roland Berger, thinking about startups? Well, the first reason is because startups is driving the future. So, and here just some facts, some of it you may know, some of it may be as surprising as it was for me when we did the study. Like if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, I mean, companies have changed from an average year of 61 years to now being 20 years old only. So some of them are really startups themselves or have been startups very recently. Second factor is that if you think about 50% of employment is coming from startups. 50% of new jobs are coming from startups. A third factor is, if you look, it's in 2021, it was 600 billion investment in startups. And then lastly, where do our disruptions and radical innovation come from? And I mean, some of these companies, I mean, I'm quite sure you know all of them, but they until recently have been startups themselves. So we see startups is really a big part of our whole innovation space globally. So let's move forward. Thinking about startups, why this relationship between corporates and startups? My strong belief is that actually it's to a mutual benefit of both sides. And some of these factors will be known to you. So let's start with the corporate side. For corporates, the first factor clearly is that startups bring innovation. So it's new technologies, it's especially areas outside of their core competences, which they get through startups. Second one, startups can also open new markets. It can be a relatively fast and cheap way to explore into new areas, which a big tanker would take for years and almost impossible to enter in these new markets. Then obviously startups bring new talent culture. This is not purely positive. I mean, if I talk to some, I mean, I'm from Stuttgart, so the town of Porsche and of Daimler. If I talk to some of my friends at Daimler, who have been part of Daimler Business Innovation and these groups, who have experienced the life of startups and working together with startups, quite often they tell me, well, the culture is fantastic. It's really a super experience. But after 2 or 3 years, it's very difficult to get back into the tanker of Daimler. So in that sense, yes, it can change culture, but it's not a very easy way sometimes. And lastly, startups for corporates also obviously can bring some cost savings. They can do it, explore things, pilot things much cheaper than the startups. So overall, we have many quotes from our clients in the corporate world, which says, well, it's necessary to work together with startups, like here from the CEO of Porsche. And when we did some study, we found out that the success of innovations is actually twice as high if the corporates work together with the startups. So that's one side of the piece. And until 10, 15 years ago, you would have said, well, that's enough. If we see a startup, we pick it and we buy it, and that's it. This is no longer the case. And companies like BASF and so have had very bad experience with that, where they just acquired these startups, and all competence, all key people from the startups have left very, very, very fast. So it needs to have as well benefits for the startups. And we do see these benefits. The first one being a validation of what they do. I mean, you could almost say, if you don't find a corporate which is interested in your idea, then I would really question if the idea is good enough. So it's almost a sanity check for your business idea. Secondly, very often it's a customer access. Customer can be the customers of your corporate partner, but it can also be the corporate partner itself. Like, for example, the accelerator of Deutsche Bahn, so German Railway, Mindbox. I mean, for them, it's really the access to Deutsche Bahn, to the large infrastructure, which usually for a startup is almost impossible to get into, other than when you work together with Deutsche Bahn as part of their startup ecosystem. Then it's expertise that you get. For some of the customers, for example, for some of the startup partners of BMW Startup Garage, the most interesting thing is that the startup garage is at the same building as the advanced research of BMW. So you are working directly together with the engineers from BMW. You can directly explore your own ideas, not with the current generation of cars, but with the next generation of cars, which is super important. And you can see, does it work or does it not work? And last but not least, it's also a factor of capital. So I told you in the last slide that there was in 21 a total budget of 600 billion in the world. We expect in 23 to halve that money. So it's only around 300 billion. And you see that decline both in Europe and in the US happen. So it's even more important for the smaller amount of budget to get this budget through collaborations with these startups. And we talked with several of the startups in accelerators, participating in accelerators. And all of them, or most of them, have been very, very positive. Like here, this quote, have a name associated with us, like BMW, like Daimler, like the other companies. And we have some other quotes here, which all go in this direction of reputation, network, and so on. What I was most fascinated by talking to these startups is actually that they also said, well, the company, the corporate can help us also, in fact, with speed. So it can be faster, which I was surprised because usually you always talk about the tanker as being very, very slow, but it can help to get faster access to the market, for example. And they were also usually quite positive about mentorship and knowledge, where quite often in the past we heard the startups rather say, well, the corporates, they are so far away that their mentorship is not helpful for us. But this has actually, in my mind, quite changed. So if we go further into that, we also see, obviously, the success examples. I mean, everybody likes to talk about success. I mean, I've just taken a few, one of them. Everybody knows after Corona, the BioNTech and Pfizer relationship. But then we also know the successful corporate ventures, like, for example, for P&G and InBev, the beer company. P&G, what I find interesting, I mean, all of us who have been in innovation space have known P&G like connect and develop for years. But I found in the recent years, P&G Ventures has actually become more and more important. So this relationship, direct relationship to the startups. And then on this page, you also see one which we as a company, Roland Berger, has with Visa, our own startup hub that we have in Berlin called Spielfeld. And I mean, we are really proud of it that actually in the last 10 years or so since that exists, even less, I think 2016, so 7 years, there's already 2 unicorns which came out of that startup. So given just this experience, I strongly believe you can increase the likelihood of success of both startups by working together with the corporates. But on the other side, there's also the negative examples, just some of them. And the reasons for that, some of them may be familiar to you, like the Vodafone engagement in Silicon Valley failed, apparently too far away from their headquarters. So they, I think in 2014, they decided to go back and build the innovation lab in London. And actually, we had similar experiences in some of our clients. I worked together with Roche, and we built a very, very good concept incubator in Silicon Valley as well. Super ideas, super technologies, but unfortunately never accepted by their headquarters in Germany. In that sense, it failed, not because they were not good enough, but because the linkage to corporate was not well enough defined. Ogilvy Labs, more on the advertising side, I mean, they built this startup lab around their core business of advertising, and they saw that this is not working. Now, in the meantime, they've, by the way, started new labs, new innovation labs, but more on the social space, on diversity space, so more on topics which are interesting kind of for the world. We also see, like in my hometown in Daimler, and they built this lab in Berlin. They sold it in 2020 to an investor because they didn't see the benefits of it, which doesn't mean that Daimler doesn't have innovation vehicles. They have several innovation vehicles still, but they failed with that lab, which they developed, and was that, well, we also need to be in Berlin like everybody in Germany. And then there's also the hackathons, which we have seen in the past, like from American Airlines and others. which sometimes could be successful, but some of them have also stopped because they didn't see the commercial success out of that. So overall, if we look into it, and we have done some studies, we actually see that the hype of startup engagements is actually over. There was a time in 2019 when there was 900 billion money burned per year in startup engagements. And we see that at the moment that 70% were unsuccessful. So, I mean, you could say 70% is still okay, because if we think about only 1 out of 10 startups is successful, then 30% of all corporate engagements is good. But for most corporates, this is actually by far not acceptable, because, I mean, obviously, if they invest in such a vehicle, they want to be not at 100%, but they want to have a high likelihood of success. So what we did is we looked in what is in these corporates which are successful, what do they do different from them? And there's no surprise on it, but I still like the list of the 4. Number 1 is setting clear goals between the corporate and the startups. And we did some analysis of companies, and we found out that the result, the likelihood of success increased by 50% if you had these goals defined compared to when you didn't have clear goals defined. It's about thinking long-term. So if you don't go for several years, and we see the number usually 6 to 8 years, then rather don't start such an investment. And we saw several companies like Infineon and other companies which have stopped just too early on that activities together with the startups. Involving the management, super successful, super important. And we saw actually in startups that when we measured the satisfaction of the startups, that they could be doubled if the senior management from the corporates were involved in that. And last but not least, it's also about differences in the people who do it. I mean, I'm not sure if that's a global number, but I recently heard in Germany, the number of startups which are purely run by women or in the management team is 1%, compared to, I think, 70 or 80%, which is by purely men, and only the rest is kind of a mixed feature. And we always believe that diversity is an increase, and we could measure increase in innovation revenue of 20%, but many psychological studies say that it's actually much higher than that if you do it in a diverse group. Not only gender diversity, but also kind of people from different countries, people from different backgrounds, and so on and so on. So these as the success factors. Now looking at kind of what is the different vehicles. And I mean, you know all of them, and we also had this picture with 5 others of these. So it's just a more illustrative chart of kind of the key vehicles that we use. And what we see in that is that most companies, they come and ask us as a consultant, well, I want to build an accelerator. And usually the first question we ask them is why? Why is it an accelerator? Why is it not something else that you need? Are you sure you need an accelerator? Because quite often it's for different purpose, different vehicles. And in most of the big corporates that we're working with, it's actually multiple vehicles for different purposes. So most often it's not the one thing which works for all their goals. And this to understand that, and to understand what is needed at what stage and for which objectives, is quite important, that we have seen in the past and where we usually work together with our clients. The second point, which comes very in more recent times, is then to see kind of, now what do we need in terms of digital support on that? How can artificial intelligence help us? And here we just, again, some examples for the different vehicles where we and our customers, when we work together with our clients, what we see is most helpful. In the incubator side, artificial intelligence solutions are mostly brought in kind of matchmaking. How do we bring these startups and the corporates together? Kind of what is the best fit between the two? And the second one is also, how do they communicate to each other? So involving chatbots and other assistants that are AI-based. When we go more into the business building side, it's actually other elements of AI which are used in our projects, which is predictive analysis And it's also using AI to build prototypes to help building the proof of concepts behind that. Whereas if we go more to the financial world, which is on the corporate venture capital, then we have often the use of the big data behind that, behind our artificial intelligence solutions. It's used for the due diligence process, but it's also for the screening process, for the scouting, finding these potential targets which are most promising to our customers. If we go one step further, is what do we do with our, and this will do this very quickly because it's not really different from many other consulting projects, but maybe just to highlight some things which I find in our projects most intriguing for me, which I'd like to share with you is, I mean, simple process. Doing first when we work with our clients, say, where do you stand at the moment and what do you want to achieve, as is analysis. Second one, build the concept, and third one, making it happen. What's important in that is, in this first step, is really to clearly articulate the ambition that the company wants. What do they want to achieve? Because very often, I mean, when looking in hindsight at failures, it was not clearly defined what they wanted to do. It was hip to also have a startup incubator. It was something which they've seen with their competitors, but they didn't want actually what to do that. And they didn't have the plan how to use it then also for the commercialization. So they had great events, fun events, cool events with nice lemonade and everything behind that, but they never knew how to make money out of it. So it's really, this is defined already in the as-is analysis. In the concept phase, for us, it's important that this is, as in most innovation projects, it's a quite structured process. It's not something with like, yeah, let's see what happens, what comes out of it, but it's a very, very disciplined, driven process to go through. And then in the third one, go live. Obviously here it's as soon as possible to try out, similar to any kind of design thinking process and so on. How does it work? What can we do? Let's do a pilot to see if it flies or not. And almost most important for us is actually step number 4, or the module number 4, which is from the get-go to use some of these existing startup relationships, because in them you can already see what's working, what's not working for this company. And I think that's super, super important that you do that from day one, because then you can help these companies and they can become a multiplier for other elements in the world. Now, to show you just one example of what we usually apply when working with these companies is a very simple structure of what we call the guiding principles in this kind of corporate startup engagements, where you see here 8 of the very initial questions that we ask. And I don't want to go through all of them. I mean, you will get this presentation, you can go through, but let me just take like a few of them. The first one, what is the goal of the project? So very clearly, I mean, it's a simple question which always asked is, do you have a strategic interest in the startup or financial interest in the startup? But even on the strategic side, it has to be divided between, is it strategic in terms of a growth ambition, entering a new market or grow a certain area that you are already targeting? Or is it more a cultural aspect where you say, okay, it's additional resource, it's a talent pool in software direction or in some kind of digital solution directions? Or is it a mindset thing? What do you want to achieve? And just to take on the other end of the spectrum, a very operational one, number 8, you also need to look kind of what is the maturity stage you want to look at in these companies. So are you at the stage of pre-seed? It's very, very early on, being aware that it may take a long time until you get to a result of that. Or do you want to go into the late stage where you say, okay, it costs us a lot, but at least we can expect already first commercial or scalable results within a year or 2. So you can read the other questions. I don't want to go through all of them, but going through this list, spending a day together with the corporates and just getting clarity on them is super helpful, is in my mind one of the most important starting points to make sure that it's not going off the wrong direction from day one. So one page on us, on Roland Berger, and not describing our company, but I think what's more important is some of the relationships that we have in the global startup world in the different countries and different regions. I've already mentioned, which you see in the middle, our Spielfeld, our own digital hub in Berlin. But then thinking about the original of this call here, we also have quite a bit in the Middle East. Like we have helped in Abu Dhabi, which probably you all know, the Hub 71 in their strategy. I personally was involved in Thailand, that you see right of that, the True Digital Park, which I'm really proud of, which has developed into the largest digital park in Southeast Asia from nothing 5 years ago. And they've really done super work in developing this concept, working together with startups and becoming the hub for everybody, not only for the startups who want to work there, but I would say every global organization who wants to do business in Thailand at the moment in a digital world will have to approach True Digital Park, because that's the place to be. That's the knot in the spider net which you see which you see arising in that country. And you see some of the other examples on that page. So to conclude, there was one more question which I was asked in developing this corporate startup engagement teaser here on that, which is, Steffen, is that timely? Is that the wrong moment, given that at the moment we are kind of a downturn, we are possibly entering a recession and so on? And that was the moment when I said, well, let me add 2 pages to my presentation here, which actually I developed already 2 years ago during the Corona crisis, which I believe are a clear signal. Yes, it's now the right moment to talk exactly about that. The first one is history. It's history about looking at innovations and crisis. And it's fascinating if you look at this chart. Just some examples how in each of the major crises in the last 100 years, major innovations came out of it. It's really interesting that kind of, even if 70–80% of the companies are going into a downturn, some companies manage to come up with the disruptive innovations. And sometimes it's completely new things. Sometimes it's also investments in innovation. So my favorite example is actually the one which you see on the very bottom, again on Daimler. They acquired actually in the crisis, in this financial crisis, 2007, 2008, they acquired 9% of Tesla with a, I mean, sorry to say it, but with some pocket money of 50 million. They acquired these 10%. If Daimler had kept that share in Tesla, it would mean that they had doubled the value that they have at the moment. They have a market capitalization, I think, of 80 billion or 85 billion, and it would be double with the 10% of Tesla. Now, unfortunately, they haven't kept one of the success criteria, but they have sold the 9% after 5 years, which means that they only value 80 million and not 160 million right now. So examples from the past, and I promised you a second argument, which is current world. So we have done during the Corona crisis a study. We talked to more than 50 CTOs and other innovation heads of major companies and asked them, okay, what does it mean, innovation by crisis for you, or innovation in the crisis for you? Is it important? And the clear message is like the 5 things that you see in here. Yes, innovations will bring us some efficiency gains. Innovation or in the crisis, we will also kill more projects. We will be more restrictive on that, but it definitely increases the return on innovation. We are getting much more in these times out of it. And by the way, number 4 and 5, it will also bring us new ways of work. I mean, we have all experienced that. Otherwise, we would probably sit together in one of these large rooms and have traveled for 2 days and all be in the middle of a bad jet lag. And now we are sitting here and everybody's doing this for 1 hour and probably doing 5 other projects afterwards today. And lastly, it's also a radical project execution. So taking this learning back to my personal introduction that I had at the very beginning, I mean, yes, my daughter failed 2 years ago. And probably she failed also because she tried to do it by herself. And when Corona came, and she didn't have any backup, no corporate behind her or anything like that, it just was no way for her to continue and to succeed. So she stopped her startup initiative. If I look at my two cousins, the one cousin who I told you is the serial entrepreneur, he focused during that time. So at the moment, he focused especially on two of the startups. One is working closely with an insurance very successfully, and the other one with an industrial player. And both of these programs are quite successful. But he has terminated 3 or 4 of his other startups. So very clearly focus. And the last cousin, my second cousin, who I told you of, at that time, what did he do? I mean, he was focusing with his second startup on the blockchain technology. So he developed for Germany, and I think it was even across Europe, the Corona One app. And he became, with the Corona One app, the senior partner of IBM. He, as a startup, senior partner of IBM. And I think this shows you can succeed. You can also succeed in difficult times. And it's super important to do it right. And I strongly believe it's also important to work it together with corporations. And this corporation startup engagement can actually help both sides. With that, thank you very much. I've taken my half hour. HP, back to you.
Yeah, so Steffen, thank you very much. Great presentation. Let's turn the presentation off and just get the talking heads up. Great. So Steffen, this is what we call a timely stop in our presentation for a few minutes from the sponsors. So we're going to have a little video, just reminding everybody what the Global Council for Innovative Organizations is. So Victor, if you don't mind playing that video.
المجلس العالمي للمؤسسات المبتكرة مجلس فريد من نوعه يمثل مؤسسات عالمية من مختلف قارات العالم. هذه المؤسسات مختصة بالابتكار وبدعم الابتكار وبتعزيز ثقافة الابتكار في المؤسسات وفي الجهات الموجودة في مختلف هذه الدول. المجلس بيكون له دور كبير في دعم تبادل ونقل المعرفة ونقل الابتكارات الموجودة في مختلف قارات العالم ومختلف المؤسسات الموجودة على مستوى العالم، ودعمها وتأثيرها ونقلها للمؤسسات الموجودة سواء في دبي وفي دولة الإمارات أو على مستوى الدول المشاركة في هذا المجلس. برنامج دبي للتميز الحكومي يعتبر أحد الأعضاء المؤسسين لهذا المجلس، والبرنامج كان له دور وباع كبير في دعم الابتكار والمبتكرين على مدى ال20 سنة الماضية، من خلال المبادرات اللي يقدمها، من خلال الفئات الموجودة في جائزة برنامج دبي للتميز الحكومي. البرنامج له دور كبير في هذه المبادرة، وسيدعم الابتكار والمبتكرين وثقافة الابتكار على المستوى المحلي وعلى المستوى العالمي، وسيساهم في نشر كل الإنجازات وكل الابتكارات الموجودة على مستوى دبي للعالم بأسره.
Steffen, thank you very much for your presentation. It's a very timely presentation. And in my work around the world, I'm seeing increasingly corporates looking at corporate venturing, trying to look for startups to help them grow, identify insights, trends, and even new growth engines for their businesses. And I'll start with a couple of questions, but get the audience ready. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll make sure we'll cover them. Steffen, you and I have been doing innovation for more than 25, 30 years together. We've seen big companies enter the space of incubators, accelerators, and all that. And we've also seen the challenges of making it real. And you spelled that out very clearly. The question I have for you is, why are CEOs increasingly looking at startups as a source for growth? And are they also at the same time doing that for the internal teams? Have they increased the budgets doing both, or are they dividing the budgets in terms of what they're doing? So that's my first question.
Well, let me take one example, which I was really surprised in the recent weeks and months. CEO of BMW. Now, everybody knows, obviously, BMW appreciates technology, and everybody who knows BMW knows this is the technology company, and intelligence in BMW is in these two big towers in Munich, where you have the R&D department. The CEO of BMW has publicly announced a few months ago saying that innovation in the future for BMW comes from our procurement department. So when I heard that first time, I thought, well, he's kidding, because I mean, we in Roland-Berger have procurement and we have innovation, and that's probably the people I speak the least, at least in the past. And all of a sudden, procurement should be the one who drives innovation. So I asked, why is that? And then I understood, and it's actually really interesting, because innovation and procurement means that procurement is looking at the outside world, what's going there. It's both looking at startups, but it's also looking at other corporations to work with. I mean, we talked 10, 15 years ago about open innovation, but it's more and more also like the new players on the block, which really make the difference. And so this is one part of the question. I believe that more and more people are thinking, yes, we need to add the outside world knowledge to be successful in the future. Now, the second part of your question, Hitendra, was what does this mean for the internal department? Can we close the two towers in Munich? No, we can't. I think it's very important to also have the counterpart inside, and also have the people who use the knowledge from the external world to work together with. And again, if I continue with that example in BMW, I think it's very smart that they have built the startup garage in the building of the R&D. So in that sense, I think it's getting more and more in this direction, where our clients, they very often think nowadays about ecosystems. Ecosystems about a series of partners, smaller partners, larger partners, it doesn't matter, but what fits best together to achieve jointly this kind of future direction, because you have to be broader in the future direction, but you have less time for this, so you can't do it by yourself only.
Great. Steffen, one of the things that I used to work in Motorola, and we had Motorola Ventures back in the 90s. And back in the 70s, there was also another version of that. And so we've had maybe 5 cycles of corporate venturing, of going up investments and decreases and goes back up again. What's different about this cycle? What's different about this cycle that makes us more confident that the returns are going to be greater than in the past? And therefore, we should be more confident, and therefore we should be doing this. And then the argument to every CEO why we should be doing this.
I'm not sure if it's a cycle, Hitendra. I'd rather say for me, it's almost a continuum in a direction where the investments in startups are more directed. So in the past, quite often, I mean, what I've seen from our clients, they were a little bit kind of spreading everywhere, kind of any kind of sandbox was allowed. And nowadays, the investments and the thinking in how to structure the new ecosystem is much more directed, in a sense of, okay, what is the focus? What do we need? And what is the missing gaps that we need to fill through competence? Do we have it internal? Do we have it external? And if we have it external, then what fits best to that? So there's more structure in thinking about who are the right startups to work with.
Got it. Steffen, as you were saying this, what came to mind is Bain Capital, Blackstone, and other players in the industry who are known to look for the startups, and they're known to actually grow those things into big successful ventures and unicorns, Kleiner Perkins and others. What I feel that you're saying is it's time for every company, every Fortune 500 company, to have its own internal Kleiner Perkins. It's all internal types of people skilled in identifying those ventures focused on what you want to do, and also to be able to fund them and to drive them forward, and then become a return on investment on those financials as much as strategic. Is that what I'm hearing you saying, or did I misunderstand?
Well, I would not say that every single company should build their own kind of corporate venture fund, and that the corporate venture fund or corporate venture capital is the right instrument for every single company. For some companies, it may actually not be the right thing. It may actually make sense to go through some partners, be it one of these capital firms that you mentioned, but also being with plug and play or other enablers in that could be better for some of these companies. But there is some companies where I think they should definitely, no, it's I would say differently. It's almost every company should think more carefully about what's the right approach for them is. And I think there's more companies than it was 10, 15 years ago, which have the opportunity now to think in this direction, to build their own venture arm or to build their own incubator, if they do it right and if they do it structured exactly in the way that they need in order to achieve their future ambitions.
That's great, Steffen. Thank you. So just going back, do you believe that as we increase the number of corporate venturing with more and more organizations, that the number of startups in the world will also increase and the success rates will remain the same? Or is there something about letting 1,000 flowers, or 1,000 flowers, bloom, and one of them will be the success factor, which is how the Blackstones and the other venture capital companies actually look at this? Are we going to increase the number of successes because there's more money and more focus, and therefore more startups? Or do we still believe the statistics of startups will be remain the same?
It's a difficult question. I think overall, probably statistics will pretty much remain the same. There will still be a lot of startups being needed to get to the unicorns. I think there's two factors which are playing for a higher rate of success, so to say. The one is that the people who start the startups are getting better and better qualified. So, if we look as a strategy consultant, like 20 years ago, being part of Roland Berger was always the number one for most of the business and the engineering candidates. Nowadays, we are competing to good startups. So in that sense, it's really great people who go to the startups, and also many people who exit the consultant business go into startups. So they are actually higher qualified than many of the people I've seen 20 years ago. That's number one. And number two is, yes, I also see in the companies a little less naivety than 20 years ago. There was one famous example when at that time the new CEO of Infineon, the semiconductor company, came into when they did the IPO. And they came the first day to the bourse, and they announced to the stock exchange, and he came with a Formula One car and said, "Here we are." It indicated kind of this, yeah, we can do everything. And so we will now open the doors for every startup. And they just, after 5 years, had to consolidate. It was quite automatic. And I think this kind of naivety is gone. And many of the corporates, they've taken the lesson, so to say. And I think they became more aware of what's needed in order not to waste money, but to use the money best purpose to also increase the return on innovation.
Steffen, there are a couple of questions in the chat, and I just want to be responsive to them. One of the questions was, in corporate venturing, is the objective to sell the company to another unicorn, to another company, or is it to absorb it? And you talk about some of the investments are financial, some of them could be strategic. What is the balance of companies that you're seeing, startup companies that are being absorbed into the core business, so strategic, or how many are being sold off financial to the market as an IPO or as an acquisition to maybe another unicorn?
So, well, first of all, let me turn around this question a little bit. I think it's important at the get-go, when we help a company to set up a corporate venture fund, it's always the first question, is it really a financial investment or is it a strategic investment? And what do you want to achieve? So if you remember this one scale in the morphological box, is it for innovation? Is it for culture, or is it for finance? And depending on that, you should also invest differently in the startups, because there is some startups where it's just no strategic fit, but it could still be financially attractive on that. And like, if I think about, I mean, I've also worked a lot in the Middle East. Some of the best investments in Middle East that I've seen, they were purely financial. They didn't have any strategic purpose, but they were still super successful investments. So in that sense, I think in corporate venture, it's difficult to say. I would, well, first of all, even in corporate venture, you have to admit that it's probably not 1 of 10 which are successful. It's probably a little higher. But still, I would still assume that 50 to 70% will not be successful. Now, from the ones which are successful, I think there is quite a number which can be brought into the company. So I know, for example, for Deutsche Bahn, their venture fund, I think there is still, they always claim that 50% of their investments are still working together with Deutsche Bahn. So that's clearly a strategic purpose. I know from other companies where I would say it's more than 50%, which are clearly going into an exit option and where they want to make money. I would say most of the big corporates, especially like the more German ones, I would call them, they are going towards the strategic objective and they use it less as a financial instrument. If I think about the Anglo-Saxon companies, I think it's more tending towards the financial side.
It's great, Steffen. And I remember business school training, and we were told always that the business unit should focus on a core business, and the profits should then be given to shareholders, and the shareholders then can invest in the stock market or in startups or anything else, and it should not be the responsibility of the business to do that. Very much like the German approach is what you're mentioning. But what you're saying now is companies believe they know how to manage the money better than the shareholders, and therefore they should be investing it also in financial and Anglo companies. And what's your forecast on that, on the success of being financial investors versus strategic investors?
Well, it's a pendulum, I would say. So it's going from one side to the other. I mean, think about the financial world. I mean, if I remember conversations we had with Deutsche Bank managers who said, well, let's get rid of the whole banking business because it's all about investments. And then they had this major trouble in the investment side, and it turned completely to the other side. And let's say, well, we get rid of the investment arm and only focus on banking. So my assumption is actually, I would say the companies will focus more on the core business, so on the strategic side. And they leave the financial investments to the professionals on the financial side and don't claim to be professional themselves.
Steffen, what's happening nowadays is in corporate venturing, many of the startups are now being coached or guided by people on the inside of the company to try and merge the cultures and make sure that if it's strategic, they can be absorbed in a nice way. But people still struggle because there's a strong cultural difference between startup culture and a big organization. What are the guidance you would have for people out there to say how to make those things really work? What are the watch outs, or what's the new thing that we can use that will allow us to have a higher success rate?
Well, first of all, try to avoid the word that you just used. If I hear the word absorb, I think that's a no-go word for this collaboration, because it's not about absorption. I mean, this is, Hidendra, sorry to say, but for me, the very traditional way of seeing it. I mean, I've had these conversations with several of the German companies like BASF, Bayer, and others who also talked about absorb the startups. That's no longer the case. And at the moment, the case is really talking on eye level and in some cases working with the startups as equal partner to build a new business area, for example. And in that sense, it doesn't matter what what the revenue is of the startup, but it matters about what they jointly want to achieve. And I think some of the new CEOs, like in BMW and also Oli Kalenius in Daimler and so on, they have seen that actually nowadays it's very different from the past. I mean, if I look at the former CEO of Bosch, when he talked about startups, he always talked about them. Yeah, what's the technology that we can get from them to integrate in our business? That's no longer the way to see it. It's the way kind of how can we do everything in our big tanker to make sure that the technology from the startup becomes successful and becomes a commercial success, and how can we participate on that success? Then it becomes a completely different game than to absorb the startup inside the company. That usually does not work, and I've seen very few cases where kind of a startup was integrated in the company, and then usually what you get is after 3-4 years, the key people in the startup will leave the company because they just cannot stand the corporate culture. So you need to really build this new culture jointly and not kind of try to integrate them.
So Steffen, are those companies spin-outs? Are they given autonomy? Are they their own legal entity with its own legal governance that allows that for you to do that? Because our experience has always been that there's a big driver from HR saying we got common values, common culture, common mission, vision, and that's the glue that holds the company together. And if you allow the startups to come in with some of their culture, it can create problems in the core business. So what's the guidance in that? What's the governance structure, or what's the physical location separation, perhaps? I don't know. Which allows you to be able to say, this is a joint venture, this is a partner of equals, and therefore we're going to do something, while on the other side, you got a core business to run.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's multiple questions behind that. First, legal structure. I mean, sometimes it's required to have a legal structure. So for example, usually for a corporate venture fund, you need a separate legal structure in order to not risk the big company setup. However, for the startups and how to work together with the startups, it's not always necessary to have a legal structure, an own legal structure. I mean, again, 10 years ago, you would have talked about the tanker and the speedboat, and the speedboat is left alone and let them do their thing. I don't think it's this clear separation anymore, which is most successful. I think what you need to do is to kind of come together in both entities. And sometimes it's not for the full business, but it's part of the big business only, which approaches the startup. But then together, the startup people and the corporate people work together. I mean, and physically, I mean, the whole world has changed since Corona. So what does it mean, work physically together? 10 years ago, again, you would have said they all need to sit in one building, in one infrastructure. Nowadays, we are all working remote. So it's no longer needed to have the company there. We've recently worked for Neo, like who at least everybody in GCC knows, the largest infrastructure in the world, and we have helped them build an innovation ecosystem. And most of the innovation ecosystem partners, they are not located in Saudi Arabia, and they will, for a foreseeable future, not sit with their office in the middle of the desert somewhere in Saudi Arabia, but they will still work remotely together, and it's possible like that. But you need to have this constant exchange between the teams to make it happen. So in that sense, I think Corona has helped all of us to make this more feasible than it was 10, 20 years ago when a big player like, I remember BASF had this super nice office in the middle of their campus, which was exclusively for startups, so they could work together with the BASF people. This is no longer needed.
Steffen, we are approaching the end of our session. I think the knowledge that you're sharing is very valuable to the audience. What Steffen is talking about is there are many ways to to drive growth in your organization. There are many reasons to collaborate with startups to bring culture into your organization, which might be exciting and different than what it used to be as it gets older. And this approach is beginning to show success. And you got to be thoughtful about it. You got to be very careful about it, but it can be done. And we are seeing success cases all over the world. And Steffen, what I would like to do is maybe give you the last minute to be able to give any coaching or guidance to the audience about what you do and maybe how they can collaborate with you. But and a message saying, guys, you know, this is what I think you should be doing. So I want to give you the last minute, the last word.
Thank you very much, Hitendra. So first of all, I mean, I see on my screen that there are 36 messages in the chat. So I assume you haven't been able to capture all these 36 in your questions here, even if you tried, Hitendra. So the first thing I can say, everybody who hasn't his or her questions answered here, please feel free to reach out to me, to us. The presentation, I assume, will be shared in this community. So reach out, let me know. What I would suggest to you is, I mean, it's always good to learn from the experiences from others. And I mean, also, I mean, Hitendra with the Jimmy Institute and others, there are people who have had this experience, who have had similar experiences. So use that knowledge. Don't try to make the same mistakes that a lot of other people have made before. And I mean, usually it's good to talk to enough people before you start such an initiative. And then you will probably make 50% of the mistakes that others have made. Not most important thing almost is do something. I mean, what we learned in this crisis study that we have done 2 years ago is that the worst result came from companies who became complacent, who didn't do anything, who said, well, let me wait until this turmoil is over and then we start again. And we have seen how many companies during that time have done exactly the opposite, have innovated, have approached startups, have worked with them, and have really received a super benefit compared to others. So this competitive advantage is just coming from do something, try it. I mean, in a similar innovation mode, sometimes you have to fail to really become successful in the second step.
That's great. Steffen, you are a wealth of knowledge, tons of experience. You've been in the innovation space longer than most individuals. You were there when innovation wasn't cool, and now everybody's talking about innovation everywhere. And so for everybody in the audience, please feel free to reach out to Steffen Gackstatter. He's a senior partner at Roland Berger, you know, and he leads the innovation practice. And he has got a wealth of experience working with all kinds of companies out there. Steffen, thank you very much. And I'll leave the message for everybody who's listening in from the GCIO. Our objective is to find partners and collaborate with people around the world who have got frameworks on how to make innovation real, frameworks that allows all of us to do things in a different and a better and a faster way. Today's speaker told us about open innovation, about collaborating with startups, investing in startups as a way to accelerate your own growth in your companies, but also to see it in new ways. And for the first time, I saw also financial investment as a way to do these things. So with that, thank you very much, Steffen. Thank you, Roland Berger. And from the GCIO, this is Hitendra Patel signing off. Thank you very much for being at this particular weekly session.
Thank you.